Hey everyone, how are you all doing today? Tonight, we're stepping back into one of the most enduring civilizations the world has ever known, Imperial China. For more than 2,000 years, emperors ruled vast lands stretching from the rice paddies of the south to the deserts of the north, from bustling cities along the coast to remote mountain villages. To the outside world, China appeared timeless, orderly, and majestic. But for those who lived within it, daily life could be far more complicated, often unforgiving. We sometimes imagine ancient China as a world of serene gardens, elegant poetry, and wise philosophers debating the balance of yin and yang. And yes, that world existed, but it was only a small slice of reality. For the vast majority of people, survival meant grueling labor, obedience to strict social rules, and the constant fear of punishment if you stepped out of line. The emperor was not just a ruler. He was the son of heaven, a divine figure whose word carried the weight of cosmic order itself. To disobey imperial law was not simply a crime against the state, it was an offense against the universe. Beneath him stretched a rigid hierarchy of officials, scholars, landowners, soldiers, peasants, and laborers, each bound by duty to the family, the clan, and the state. Every gesture, every word, every decision in daily life was shaped by this immense web of authority, and life, for most, was hard. Farmers bent their backs in the fields from dawn to dusk, coaxing grain from the earth under the burden of heavy taxes. Merchants, though sometimes wealthy, were viewed with suspicion. Ranked low in the social order because they profited from trade rather than labor. Women lived under strict expectations of obedience and chastity, their lives largely defined by fathers, husbands, and sons. Punishments for disobedience could be brutal, and mobility, both social and geographic, was rare. To live in Imperial China was to live under constant pressure. Pressure to serve your family honorably, pressure to obey your superiors, pressure to avoid disgrace. A single mistake could ruin not only your life, but the reputation of your entire household. It was a system that demanded endurance, discipline, and unflinching loyalty. So when we ask the question, why wouldn't you last a day in Imperial China? The answer is not just about harsh laws or dangerous punishments. It is about a society built on duty, hierarchy, and sacrifice, where survival depended not on freedom or comfort, but on how well you could endure the weight of tradition. If you had been dropped into Imperial China without preparation, the first thing that would strike you wouldn't be the grand palaces or the bustling market sit would be the rules. Every moment of life, from the way you spoke to the way you dressed, was shaped by a code of conduct that left little room for individuality. At the heart of this system was Confucian philosophy, which emphasized order, duty, and respect for hierarchy. To the Chinese, society was like a vast family. The emperor was the father of the nation, his officials, the elder brothers, and the common people, the obedient children. Just as a child was expected to obey his parents without question, so too were citizens expected to obey their rulers. For men, the path to honor was clear but narrow. If you were born into a poor farming family, you worked the land sun up to sundown, season after season. Your body was bent by labor long before your hair turned gray, and much of what you grew was taken as tax. For the ambitious, there was one shining possibility: the imperial examinations, grueling tests of classical knowledge and literary skill. Success could elevate a farmer's son into the ranks of the scholar officials, but the odds were slim. Only a fraction of candidates ever passed, and the exams demanded years of study, often without guarantee of reward. For women, the rules were even stricter. They were expected to embody the virtues of obedience, modesty, and loyalty to their husbands' families. Stories of virtuous widows who refused to remarry, if it meant a lifetime of poverty, were held up as moral examples. A woman's honor was tied not to her achievements, but to her submission and silence. To defy this was to risk shame, ostracism, or worse. Even leisure was regulated. Clothing, colors, and fabrics were dictated by your social rank. Wearing silk when you had no right to it could mark you as arrogant or deceitful. Public behavior was scrutinized, and failing to observe ritual courtesies might cost you your reputation or, in some cases, your freedom. For modern eyes, such a system might feel suffocating, but for those born into it, these rules provided stability in a world where survival often depended on knowing your place. To live in Imperial China was to carry the weight of tradition with every step, to breathe discipline with every breath. And yet, beneath this rigid structure, there pulsed a society alive with contradictions, beauty and brutality, refinement and hardship, loyalty and fear. It was a world where one misstep could cost you everything. If the endless rules of Imperial China dictated how people should live, the punishments made sure they never forgot the price of breaking them. To live under the Emperor's mandate was to know that law and punishment were not abstract ideas, they were ever-present shadows, ready to strike with terrifying force. For minor offenses, penalties might include public humiliation, beatings with bamboo rods, or being forced to wear Congress-heavy wooden collars that locked around the neck and shoulders. These collars were so large that prisoners could barely feed themselves, relying on others to bring scraps of food while they stood exposed to the scorn of neighbors and strangers alike. To wear a kang was not only painful but profoundly shaming. It marked you as someone stripped of dignity, an outcast walking in full view. But the deeper the crime, the harsher the consequences. Theft, fraud, or repeated defiance could lead to hard labor, often in remote mines or construction projects, where survival rates were grim, and beyond that lay punishments meant to terrify all who watched. Execution in Imperial China was not always quick or merciful. Some criminals faced strangulation or beheading, while the most infamous sentence was linki, often translated as death by 1,000 cuts. The condemned was tied to a post while the executioner slowly sliced away pieces of flesh, prolonging the agony until life finally slipped away. It was a penalty reserved for the gravest crimes: treason, parricide, or betrayal of the emperor. These punishments carried both physical and symbolic weight. The body was not just destroyed, it was disgraced. In a culture that valued ancestor worship and proper burial, to mutilate the body was to condemn the soul to eternal unrest. The horror of execution was not only in the pain but in the belief that it severed a person from the cycle of honor and remembrance. Even lesser sentences could crush a spirit. Officials often used corporal punishment not just to correct, but to remind the population that order was everything. To be beaten before your village, to be shackled in chains, or to live with scars from bamboo rods was to carry a lifelong reminder of failure in the eyes of the state. It was this fear of pain, of shame, of losing one's place in both life and memory that kept millions in line. In Imperial China, punishment was more than justice. It was theater, it was warning, and it was power carved directly into flesh. If the endless rules of Imperial China dictated how people should live, the punishments made sure they never forgot the price of breaking them. To live under the emperor's mandate was to know that law and punishment were not abstract ideas, they were ever-present shadows, ready to strike with terrifying force. For minor offenses, penalties might include public humiliation, beatings with bamboo rods, or being forced to wear Congress-heavy wooden collars that locked around the neck and shoulders. These collars were so large that prisoners could barely feed themselves, relying on others to bring scraps of food while they stood exposed to the scorn of neighbors and strangers alike. To wear a kang was not only painful but profoundly shaming. It marked you as someone stripped of dignity, an outcast walking in full view. But the deeper the crime, the harsher the consequences. Theft, fraud, or repeated defiance could lead to hard labor, often in remote mines or construction projects, where survival rates were grim, and beyond that lay punishments meant to terrify all who watched. Execution in Imperial China was not always quick or merciful. Some criminals faced strangulation or beheading, while the most infamous sentence was linki, often translated as death by 1,000 cuts. The condemned was tied to a post while the executioner slowly sliced away pieces of flesh, prolonging the agony until life finally slipped away. It was a penalty reserved for the gravest crimes: treason, parricide, or betrayal of the emperor. These punishments carried both physical and symbolic weight. The body was not just destroyed, it was disgraced. In a culture that valued ancestor worship and proper burial, to mutilate the body was to condemn the soul to eternal unrest. The horror of execution was not only in the pain but in the belief that it severed a person from the cycle of honor and remembrance. Even lesser sentences could crush a spirit. Officials often used corporal punishment not just to correct, but to remind the population that order was everything. To be beaten before your village, to be shackled in chains, or to live with scars from bamboo rods was to carry a lifelong reminder of failure in the eyes of the state. It was this fear of pain, of shame, of losing one's place in both life and memory that kept millions in line. In Imperial China, punishment was more than justice. It was theater, it was warning, and it was power carved directly into flesh. At first glance, the imperial palace might have seemed like a dream: vast halls of red and gold, roofs sweeping upward like the wings of dragons, courtyards filled with perfumed gardens and shimmering ponds. It was the center of the empire, the place where the Son of Heaven himself ruled with divine authority. But behind its walls of grandeur, the palace was also a cage, filled with rituals, dangers, and invisible chains that could bind even the most powerful. For the emperor, life was anything but free. He lived surrounded by layers of ceremony that dictated every movement. When he rose in the morning, when he ate, when he spoke, each act followed strict ritual. Even his meals, often lavish feasts of dozens of dishes, had to be carefully tested for poison. Servants and eunuchs hovered constantly, ensuring that nothing went against protocol. To the outside world he was omnipotent, but within the palace he was the most observed, the most restricted man in all of China. The palace was also home to thousands of others: concubines, eunuchs, guards, and servants, each caught in webs of intrigue and ambition. For concubines, beauty could raise them to extraordinary heights of influence, but it could just as easily condemn them to jealousy, exile, or even death. A single misstep, a careless word, or the favor of the wrong ally could turn privilege into ruin overnight. Eunuchs, castrated men who served in the inner court, wielded enormous power as the emperor's closest attendants. Some became kingmakers, shaping politics behind the scenes, yet their lives, too, were bound to the palace, their bodies marked by sacrifice, their fortunes tied to the emperor's whims. Even within this world of splendor, punishment lurked. A concubine accused of betrayal might be executed in silence, her name erased from records. A eunuch who fell out of favor could be flogged, exiled, or worse. The palace was not just a home, it was a pressure chamber, where luxury and danger coexisted in every breath. To step into the forbidden city was to enter a world dazzling in beauty but suffocating in control. Power here was intoxicating but fragile. The palace reminded everyone, from the lowest servant to the emperor himself, that in Imperial China, no one was ever truly free. Far from the gleaming walls of the forbidden city, most people in Imperial China lived lives of backbreaking labor and constant uncertainty. The empire's heart was not only in its palaces and armies but in its villages, where farmers, artisans, and laborers toiled day after day just to survive. For the vast majority, farming was not a choice but a destiny. Families worked small plots of land, growing rice, millet, or wheat depending on the region. Every season was a gamble. Too little rain, too much rain, or a sudden swarm of locusts could erase an entire year's labor. Famine was a constant shadow, and when harvests failed, peasants often had no choice but to sell their belongings, or even themselves, into servitude. Taxes made survival even harder. The emperor's officials demanded grain, labor, or money, and there was little mercy for those who could not pay. A poor harvest did not excuse a tax bill, and failure to meet obligations could lead to confiscation of land, imprisonment, or forced labor on massive state projects like building canals or fortifications. For many, the empire's splendor was built directly on their exhaustion. Daily life was also bound tightly by hierarchy. A person's place in society, whether as farmer, merchant, soldier, or scholar, dictated what they could wear, where they could live, and even what punishments they might face. Moving outside of one's assigned role was dangerous, sometimes even criminal. Social mobility was possible through the grueling imperial examination system, but few peasants could afford the years of study required to chase such a distant dream. Even within the family, strict rules prevailed. Filial piety, the absolute duty to honor and obey one's parents, was a pillar of Chinese life. Disobedience could bring not only shame but legal consequences, as the state enforced these family hierarchies with the same severity it enforced loyalty to the throne. For common people, survival in Imperial China meant navigating a world where nature, government, and tradition all pressed down relentlessly. To endure required strength, patience, and sometimes quiet resignation. Every bowl of rice, every roof patched against the rain, was a small victory in a life that left little room for error. For those born outside the nobility, there was one narrow path that promised escape from the grind of peasant life: the imperial examinations. On paper, it was a brilliant idea, an open system where any man, regardless of birth, could rise to prominence through intellect and perseverance. In reality, it was one of the most punishing gauntlets ever devised by a human society. The exams were rooted in Confucian philosophy, demanding not only mastery of literature, poetry, and moral teachings, but also the ability to apply these ideals to governance. Candidates were expected to memorize thousands of lines of classical texts word for word. A single slip in a single character could ruin years of preparation. The pressure was suffocating. Families often sacrificed everything to support a son's education, hoping he might bring honor and wealth to the clan if he succeeded. When exam season arrived, Men from across the empire converged on testing centers. They were locked in small, cramped cells, barely large enough for a desk and a stool for days at a time. Given only ink, brushes, and food. Some fell ill, some went mad, and a few even died within those suffocating walls. Success rates were brutally low. In some years, fewer than 1% of candidates passed the highest levels. And yet, the rewards were immense. Passing the exams could elevate a man from obscurity to officialdom, granting him a position in the bureaucracy that ran the empire. He would wield influence, enjoy prestige, and secure privilege for generations of his descendants. For that reason, countless families pushed their sons into the grueling cycle of study, failure, and reattempt, sometimes across an entire lifetime. But the exams were not only a ladder, they were also a trap. They reinforced conformity, punishing creativity and discouraging independent thought. They demanded blind devotion to Confucian ideals, shaping officials into servants of the system rather than challengers of it. For many, the promise of glory ended only in disappointment and wasted years, leaving them poorer, older, and broken by the relentless pursuit of an almost unreachable dream. The imperial examinations were less an opportunity than a crucible. They proved that in Imperial China, even the path to freedom was paved with suffering. Imperial China was a society built on order, hierarchy, and obedience. To keep such a vast empire in line, the state relied on a system of punishments that was as much about spectacle as it was about justice. For those who dared to defy authority, whether by crime, rebellion, or even disrespect, punishment was swift, severe, and designed to serve as a lesson to all who witnessed it. At the lighter end of the spectrum were fines, beatings with bamboo rods, or public humiliation. These punishments were common for minor infractions, but even they could be devastating. A beating from a heavy bamboo cane was not just painful, it could cripple a man for life, leaving him unable to work and plunging his family into ruin. But harsher crimes invited harsher fates. Thieves might have their noses or ears cut off, branding them forever as criminals. Corrupt officials could face exile to remote and dangerous frontiers, far from family and support. And rebels or traitors, their punishments were legendary for their cruelty. Execution by decapitation was common, but the empire also practiced methods meant to prolong suffering, such as linki, often called death by 1,000 cuts, in which the condemned was slowly sliced apart in front of a crowd. Even families of criminals were not always spared. In cases of treason, entire clans could be executed or enslaved, a reminder that disloyalty poisoned not only the individual but the bloodline itself. The empire's message was clear: order was sacred, and disobedience would not only destroy you but stain your descendants. These punishments were never only about the guilty, they were about everyone watching. A single execution in the marketplace was meant to echo through villages and towns, embedding fear deep into the hearts of the population. By controlling bodies, the empire controlled minds. Life under this system meant living with constant caution. The wrong word, the wrong action, even being associated with the wrong person could end in catastrophe. For the average subject of Imperial China, survival meant more than growing food or paying taxes. It meant navigating a world where justice was not blind but merciless, and always watching. If the emperor ruled the empire, the father ruled the household. In Imperial China, family was more than blood ties, it was the foundation of society, the miniature version of the empire itself. Every home was a kingdom, with its own hierarchy, duties, and punishments. To survive within it, one had to know their place and never step beyond it. At the top stood the patriarch, whose authority over wife, children, and even grandchildren was nearly absolute. Confucian philosophy taught that filial piety, respect, and obedience to parents was the bedrock of morality. To defy one's father was not just a family matter. It was seen as an attack on the social fabric itself. Sons were expected to obey without question, to care for their parents in old age, and to bring honor to the family name. Women, meanwhile, lived under layers of subordination. A daughter obeyed her father, a wife obeyed her husband, and a widow obeyed her son. Marriage was less about love and more about alliance, arranged to strengthen ties between families. A bride was expected to leave behind her birth family entirely, becoming part of her husband's clan, where her role centered on obedience, labor, and, above all, producing heirs. Discipline was not only common, it was expected. Fathers and elders had the right to punish children and juniors. Sometimes with the same severity the state applied to criminals. A disobedient son could be beaten. A rebellious daughter could be cast out. Shame was a tool as sharp as any blade. Because disgrace did not fall on one person alone, it stained the entire household. Yet the family was also a refuge. In a world ruled by harsh laws and merciless officials, the household offered belonging, identity, and survival. A man without a family was vulnerable, adrift in a society that measured worth through lineage and legacy. The family name was both a shield and a chain, binding individuals into the rhythm of tradition. For the people of Imperial China, the family was not merely where life happened, it was where society itself began. The empire outside might command armies, collect taxes, and mete out justice. But within every home, the same principles of order, hierarchy, and duty held sway. To endure one was to endure the other. For all the grandeur of palaces and the poetry of scholars, the empire rested on the bent backs of its peasants. They were the silent majority, toiling in fields from sunrise to sunset, their sweat and labor feeding not only their families but the entire machinery of the state. Without them, the empire could not exist, and yet, they bore the heaviest weight of all. Taxes were relentless. A farmer might see half his harvest taken away by the government, leaving his family with barely enough to survive. In years of flood, drought, or pest infestation, the burden did not lessen. The emperor's officials demanded their share regardless of fortune. To fall short was to risk punishment, seizure of land, or even being sold into bondage. Hunger was not rare, it was an uninvited guest that visited with terrifying frequency, and it wasn't only crops that the peasants owed. Every family was expected to provide labor days, weeks, even months of unpaid work for the empire. Men were summoned to build roads, dig canals, or haul stone for monumental projects that glorified emperors but drained villagers of their strength. Some never returned, dying under collapsed scaffolding or succumbing to exhaustion and disease far from home. Life was a constant balancing act between survival and obedience. A peasant could not openly resist the state. Rebellion was met with merciless force. And yet, beneath the surface, resentment brewed. Whispers in the fields and taverns grew into uprisings that shook dynasties. For when those who fed the empire could no longer feed themselves, no throne was safe. Still, most endured. They found solace in festivals, in the cycles of planting and harvest, in the bonds of family and community. To be a peasant in Imperial China was to live under crushing weight, but also to embody resilience. They carried the empire on their shoulders, even as the empire often turned its back on their suffering. If the countryside was the empire's backbone, the cities were its beating heart. Bustling, noisy, and often overwhelming, they stood as centers of trade, administration, and culture. To step into one of Imperial China's great cities was to enter a world of contrasts, opportunity and danger. Wealth and poverty, refinement and filth all pressed together within crowded walls. Markets were the lifeblood of urban life. From dawn until dusk, stalls overflowed with goods. Silks dyed in brilliant hues, spices that carried the scent of distant lands, bronze tools, porcelain bowls so fine they seemed almost weightless. Merchants shouted prices, entertainers played music or performed acrobatics, and street food vendors fried dumplings or grilled skewers, their smoke mixing with the cries of hawkers. For many, the marketplace wasn't just about survival, it was about connection, where news, gossip, and rumor traveled as quickly as coins. But cities were also magnets for inequality. The wealthy lived behind walls and gates, in homes decorated with carved wood and lacquerware, attended by servants who kept them insulated from the chaos outside. Scholars and officials gathered in tea houses, writing poetry, debating philosophy, or arranging marriages. Just beyond their doors, beggars slept in alleys. Thieves prowled the crowds, and disease spread quickly in cramped quarters where sanitation was little more than a hope. For artisans and craftsmen, the city was both opportunity and trap. A skilled potter or blacksmith might earn steady income, but always at the mercy of guild restrictions and official taxes. Apprentices worked long hours for little reward, often bound to their masters until adulthood. Women might find work in weaving shops or as servants, but their labor was poorly paid and easily dismissed. Law and order were constant concerns. Patrols roamed the streets at night, but justice could be swift and brutal, especially for the poor. The city offered excitement and possibility, but it also demanded caution. One misstep could mean ruin, imprisonment, or worse. And yet, despite the hardship, the cities glittered with vitality. Lanterns glowed on festival nights, scholars recited verses that echoed across courtyards, and the hum of human life never truly ceased. For many, the city was the empire in miniature, crowded, complex, and full of both promise and peril. Behind the majesty of the throne, the true machinery of the empire was driven not by the emperor alone, but by the scholar officials known as mandarins. These men, products of the grueling imperial examination system, formed a vast bureaucracy that touched every corner of daily life. They were the empire's scribes, judges, tax collectors, and administrators, the invisible hands that kept order across millions of subjects. To the common people, a mandarin was both a lifeline and a threat. He might bring justice to a village dispute, but he might also demand higher taxes or enforce harsh laws. His word carried enormous weight, and to defy him was to defy the emperor himself. The bureaucracy was designed to be impartial, governed by Confucian ideals of fairness and virtue. Yet in practice, officials were human, prone to corruption, favoritism, and ambition. A fair magistrate could transform a region into a place of peace and prosperity. A corrupt one could plunge it into misery. The mandarins themselves lived under immense pressure. They were constantly monitored, evaluated, and rotated from province to province to prevent them from building local power bases. A single accusation of corruption could destroy a career built on decades of study. Their robes and hats marked them as men of status, but their lives were anything but secure. The bureaucracy was both the empire's strength and its burden. It allowed a single ruler in Beijing to control lands stretching thousands of miles, but it also created a system heavy with rules, paperwork, and inefficiency. For the peasants, artisans, and merchants who faced mandarins in the yamen, the local administrative office, the bureaucracy was not some abstract machine. It was a man with a brush and a seal, deciding their fates with a stroke of ink. To live in Imperial China was to live under this web of officials, where every grain of rice taxed, every contract signed, and every dispute judged passed through the hands of mandarins. They were the empire's nervous system, brilliant and flawed, essential and oppressive. And for ordinary people, they were a constant reminder that in China, power did not only sit on the dragon throne, it sat at the magistrate's desk, where law and authority became personal. For all its armies, walls, and officials, Imperial China rested on something less tangible but equally powerful: belief. Religion and ritual wove through every layer of life, from the grand ceremonies of the emperor to the humble prayers whispered in village shrines. To live in China was to live in a universe where the earthly and the heavenly were inseparably bound. At the heart of this system was the mandate of heaven, the idea that the emperor ruled not merely by power, but by divine right. If he governed wisely, heaven blessed the empire with peace and prosperity. If he failed, heaven sent floods, famines, and rebellions as warnings. This belief gave legitimacy to dynasties and justified their fall. To lose the mandate of heaven was to lose the throne itself. Religion among the people was richly varied. Confucianism shaped morality and social order, emphasizing duty, respect, and harmony. Taoism offered a counterbalance, valuing simplicity, nature, and the search for spiritual immortality. Buddhism carried along the Silk Roads, promised escape from suffering and the hope of enlightenment. These traditions often blended, so that a family might honor Confucian ancestors at home, visit a Taoist priest for blessings, and turn to Buddhist temples for comfort in times of sorrow. Rituals were everywhere. The emperor performed elaborate sacrifices at the Temple of Heaven, praying for good harvests on behalf of the people. Villagers celebrated seasonal festivals with lanterns, dances, and offerings, their rhythms tied to the cycles of planting and harvest. Ancestor worship bound families together across generations, with incense and offerings, ensuring that the spirits of the dead continued to watch over the living. But faith was not always gentle. Superstition and fear coexisted with devotion. Illness might be blamed on angry spirits, and charms or exorcisms were sought to drive them away. Natural disasters were read as cosmic warnings, stirring panic or rebellion, and religion, like law, could be wielded by those in power to strengthen their control. In Imperial China, to ignore ritual was unthinkable. To neglect your ancestors, to disrespect the gods, or to deny the emperor's sacred role was to stand outside the very order of the cosmos. Faith was not just personal, it was political, social, and cosmic all at once. For the people of the empire, belief was more than comfort. It was the invisible architecture of life, shaping how they understood suffering, duty, and destiny itself. For all its order and ceremony, Imperial China was never truly at peace. Beneath the calm rhythms of farming, ritual, and bureaucracy, the empire lived under constant threat, both from beyond its borders and from within. To survive in this world was to know that rebellion and war could erupt at any moment. tearing apart the fragile balance of life. On the frontiers, China faced endless pressure from nomadic tribes who roamed the steppes. For centuries, dynasties built walls, raised armies, and sent envoys to hold back these fierce riders. The Great Wall itself was less a single barrier than a symbol of this constant struggle. Soldiers stationed there endured bitter winters, isolation, and the ever-present fear of raids that could come swiftly and vanish just as quickly. Inside the empire, unrest brewed in another form. Heavy taxes, corrupt officials, famine, and natural disasters pushed peasants to the breaking point. When desperation outweighed fear, villages rose in rebellion. Some uprisings were small, easily crushed by imperial troops. Others, like the Yellow Turban Rebellion in the late Han Dynasty or the Taiping Rebellion in the Qing era, swelled into vast movements that shook the empire to its core. These revolts were fueled not only by hunger but by visions of justice, equality, or divine mandate, dreams of a new order to replace the old. For ordinary people, rebellion was a double-edged sword. Joining it promised freedom from taxes and tyranny, but it also meant risking death in battle or slaughter if the uprising failed. Staying loyal to the empire was no guarantee of safety either. Entire villages could be caught in the crossfire, burned, or conscripted into armies. Even within the palace, danger lurked. Dynasties fell not only to external invasions or popular uprisings, but also to plots and betrayals among generals, eunuchs, and courtiers. The throne itself was never entirely secure, its fate tied to the shifting winds of loyalty and ambition. War and rebellion left scars that lasted generations, fields burned, families scattered, temples ruined. And yet, each time, the empire rebuilt itself, rising from chaos with a new dynasty, a new emperor, and a renewed claim to the mandate of heaven. For those who lived through it, though there was little glory. War was hunger, fear, and loss. Rebellion was hope and despair entwined. In Imperial China, peace was never guaranteed, was a fragile pause between storms. Though daily life in Imperial China could be harsh, it was also a civilization that gave birth to some of the world's most extraordinary achievements. Out of fields of struggle and palaces of control came works of beauty, wisdom, and ingenuity that still shape human history today. Art was everywhere, from the grand strokes of calligraphy to the delicate patterns on porcelain. Calligraphy was not just writing, it was an art form, a spiritual exercise that revealed the soul of the writer. Painters captured misty mountains and quiet rivers in flowing ink, emphasizing harmony with nature and the fleeting beauty of life. These works were not mere decoration, they were philosophy made visible, reflections of a worldview that prized balance and subtlety. Literature flourished too. Poets like Li Bai and Du Fu captured both the joys of wine and friendship and the sorrows of war and exile. Their verses traveled across centuries, reminding readers that even in a rigid society, the human heart longed for freedom, love, and transcendence. Stories, dramas, and philosophical writings filled libraries, shaping not only China but cultures far beyond its borders. Music and theater also brought color to life. The haunting notes of the guqin, the lively performances of Chinese opera, and the vibrant dances of festivals infused joy into the rhythm of daily existence. For a few hours, audiences could escape the weight of taxes, duties, and punishments, losing themselves in song, story, and spectacle. And then there were the innovations that changed the world. Paper, printing, gunpowder, the compass, and advanced agricultural tools were all born in China. Products of restless minds seeking to improve both survival and expression. These creations spread far beyond the empire, shaping the course of global civilization. For the common people, culture was not always grand or elite. It lived in folk songs, sung during harvest, in shadow puppets, entertaining children, in crafts passed down through families. Beauty was not reserved for emperors and scholars, it was woven into the fabric of life, even in the humblest homes. This is the paradox of Imperial China, a society at once heavy with oppression and dazzling in its creativity. In the same land where peasants struggled to pay taxes and criminals feared brutal punishments, poetry soared, silk gleamed, and inventions reshaped the destiny of nations. It was proof that even under the heaviest weight of order and tradition, the human spirit still sought to create, to dream, and to leave behind traces of beauty. When we look back at Imperial China, it is easy to be dazzled by its achievements, the art, the inventions, the grandeur of its palaces and temples. But beneath that splendor lay a society where survival demanded obedience, where every gesture was bound by duty, and where even emperors lived in gilded cages of ritual. It was a world of beauty and brilliance, but also of fear, weight, and silence. To live there, even for a single day, would mean carrying the burden of unyielding tradition, the watchful eye of authority, and the constant awareness that one misstep could ruin not only yourself, but your family for generations. For the peasant in the fields, the scholar in his exam cell, the woman confined to duty, and even the emperor on his throne, freedom was rare and fragile. And yet, from this system emerged poetry that still stirs hearts, philosophies that still guide lives, and inventions that reshaped the world. Perhaps this is the paradox of Imperial China, the proof that even in the harshest of orders, the human spirit still sought to dream, create, and endure. History often tempts us to marvel at the greatness of empires, but the real story lies in the ordinary people who bore their weight. They remind us that power and culture are always built on sacrifice, and that survival itself can be as heroic as conquest. So as we close this journey, we are left with a question that reaches beyond dynasties, beyond borders, even beyond time. Is it better to live in a world of strict order that suffocates freedom but ensures survival, or in a world of freedom where survival itself is never guaranteed?